We're going to talk about how to submit your podcast to the iTunes Store and briefly review using some other services for distributing your podcast. What we did earlier was I showed you how to set up a podcast in MediaMill and then subscribe to that podcast using iTunes. And subscribing to the podcast means subscribing to the RSS feed. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to use the iTunes Store as the place to distribute the podcast and someplace where people can go and subscribe to your podcast via the store. So we got into MediaMill. I described to you how you set up a podcast, and we know that we have the RSS feeds all set up right here with the podcasts, and the content has been selected via the Edit tab. Okay, if we go over to our iTunes interface, all right now I'm just looking at my library, but if we go to the iTunes Store right over here on the left-hand side, in the iTunes Store there's a podcast section, and if you go to that podcast section, right in the center of the screen, I'm going to scroll down a little bit, there is a thumbnail, a link for Submit a Podcast. When you click on that link, it brings you to a new page, and this is the submission page. What it asks you to do is to provide the RSS feed, provide a link to the RSS feed that you would like to consider adding to the iTunes Store. So, from our MediaMill page, we are going to copy and paste, copy the RSS link, all right, go back to iTunes, and we're going to drop that URL into the podcast feed URL field. We hit continue, accessing the iTunes Store, and then it asks you to sign in to publish your podcast. You sign in using your Apple ID or AOL screen name and password to publish your podcast. And then if you do not yet have an account, you create one. If you have iTunes on your computer and you've bought anything using iTunes, you already have an Apple ID or AOL screen name. You have an account already set up. But if you don't have one, go ahead and set one up, and then you'll continue, and it will allow you to upload this or submit this podcast for their approval. I'm going to cancel right now because this podcast is not a real one, so I don't want them to send me an email saying, what is this garbage? We don't ever want you to publish anything on here ever again. Once you submit your podcast, it will look, it'll take a little while for it to be reviewed. There's a frequently asked questions page. Okay, and it talks about after submitting a podcast. It talks a lot about all sorts of things. Actually, what I'll do is close this, go back to my browser here. There is, in the podcasting resources pages on the Apple site, there's a lot of information about submitting your feeds. Okay, one is the submission queue. Once you submit, your podcast is placed in a queue for review by iTunes staff, and it can be rejected for a variety of reasons, and it talks all about them here. So if you feel that your podcast is pretty well put together and something that you think would be worthwhile putting into the iTunes Store, then I would say go ahead and do that. There's no reason why you shouldn't do that. Within the iTunes Store, of course, I'm going to go home here. You can choose from all sorts of different podcasts. There's a lot of free ones, and as you can see, there's all these different podcasts that you can choose from, right? Over here, you've got categories, right? Let's choose education just for the heck of it, all right? Now, there's all these featured podcasts. Your podcast would be submitted to the store as a free download, something that people can download for free. and you would want to upload a photo, something that could be used as a thumbnail to kind of show off your podcast. I don't know how strict they are about content, as far as how professional it needs to be, but I imagine if you're using the iTunes Store to distribute an educational podcast that has to do with your students in a class, if the content is decent, I don't see any reason why they wouldn't allow you to submit it through the store. Um, if you were able to submit it through the store, then what people could do is just click on your podcast in the iTunes Store, and then it would bring up the main page of the podcast, and you could subscribe to it. You'd have all the information about it, descriptions and whatnot. People might review it, so on and so forth. But down here would have all the episodes of your podcast, and people could download it right here, and it would go right into their iTunes, into the podcast library. If you submit to the iTunes Store, your end user does not need to subscribe by going to the Advanced tab, subscribe to podcast, and copy or pasting the URL. Now it just automatically goes right into the user's iTunes. Okay, so that's using iTunes. Like I said, there's lots of resources on the iTunes site, so I would definitely recommend that you check out all the different information that's available to you here. Okay. Other services that you can use besides iTunes in order to set up a podcast online, you can use Blogger. You can also use Blogger to distribute your podcast. It's a little bit more complicated than using iTunes or the iTunes Store, but it's definitely an option. So what I'm going to do is just show you that you have an option here in the Blogger page. They have a great tutorial about how to post audio or music to your blog. This is in the help section. You just go to help and then into multimedia, audio and podcasts, getting started. They have a whole bunch of information about adding your audio files, whether you want to do it from MediaMill or from another site where you host your audio files. Also, from MediaMill, what you do is you would link to it through Blogger, and they have a tutorial here, which is actually on YouTube, to show you how to do that. And it's a little bit complicated. I wouldn't say it's crazy complicated. You're just going to want to take a little bit of time to learn how to do it. But all the information is there in the Blogger site. So I would say if you want to use Blogger to distribute your podcast, go ahead, and you would use MediaMill as the place to keep your audio files. So that's another option, is you're using Blogger to distribute your podcast. An even more comprehensive option is a service like Liberated Syndication or Podomatic. These are websites where you create accounts and you can upload your content, and then this site will create the RSS feeds as well as all the links that you need in order to submit your podcast to the iTunes Store, or if you want to share that podcast maybe through Blogger or another tool, you could do that through this site. If for some reason you don't have access to MediaMill, maybe your university account has been suspended or you're no longer with the university, you can use a service like Liberated Syndication. Liberated Syndication is a pay-for service. It starts at a monthly fee of $5, and you get a 100 meg storage quota, and you can go up from there. But this would be an option that you could use if you didn't have access to MediaMill anymore. A very similar service is Podomatic. Podomatic allows you to start an account, upload your content, and then it will automatically generate your RSS feeds and other information for you that you can then post via Blogger or via the iTunes Store, so on and so forth. And there are several types of services like this. So that's really all I'm going to talk about today. Again, there are a lot of tutorials out there for you to take advantage of. There's a lot of information on the iTunes Store. There are tutorials in Blogger that you can use to help you get your podcast set up. And once more, Media Mill has great tutorials. So I would say take a little bit of time and take a look at some of these tutorials so that you understand how it all works, or at least on a basic level, so that you can take advantage of these very powerful tools to do some podcasting. Thanks a lot.